Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole DeAndrea, and I am the Assistant Director of Annual Giving and Membership at NYU Libraries. As you've heard, this event will be recorded for the library's archives. You will have to press continue to approve this. Anyone who is RSVP to this event will receive the recording link in the coming days. Thank you for joining us today. This Getting to Know event series is our virtual event series to showcase the incredible work our colleagues at NYU Libraries do each day. We seek to educate and engage while we are social distancing. We have many more of these events coming up, and I encourage you to attend any and all of them. A few Zoom housekeeping items. You have been muted upon entering this event. This is to alleviate background noise during the presentation. You will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation. There are two ways to do this. One, you may type them into the chat box, or two, use the raise hand feature at the end, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question orally. If you're unsure where to find the raise hand feature, click on the icon at the bottom of your screen called Participants, and then at the bottom window on the right side of the screen that will pop up, you'll see a button called Raise Hand, and your digital hand will be raised, and we'll be able to see it and call on you at the end of the part of the question and answer. If you can please turn off your video, it helps for a better connection for everybody. If you would like to use speaker view, where only the person who is speaking is up on your screen instead of lots of little boxes, you can enable that option on the top right corner of your Zoom screen. There will be live closed captioning for this event, and you can enable that at the bottom of your screen. That is by pressing the closed caption /CC button and selecting the show subtitle option. The captions will display at the center of the lower part of your screen. And finally, we will be showing a presentation during this event, so you can expect that screen share to come automatically. You may already see it on your screen. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Iris Bierlein is the Senior UX, that's User Experience, and Digital Accessibility Specialist at NYU Libraries. Lauren Keogh is our Accessibility and Accommodations Librarian. They will be discussing how we are supporting users with accessibility needs at NYU Libraries. Lauren will start us off. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As you can see on the screen here, we're going to be talking about accessibility in the libraries, and just to provide a quick little overview, I wanted to say that the numeronym on the screen, A11y, just in case that's not familiar to those attending, is actually used oftentimes in web design and programming to abbreviate accessibility. And it also implies kind of being an ally to accessibility. So just that's something you're going to probably see throughout the presentation. So just wanted to clarify that early on. As well, there's a link to today's presentation, which will be shared post presentation. But if you do want to follow along, there's a bit.ly there on the screen for you. And I do believe it'll be dropped into the chat as well by Nicole. So that was just a little bit more additional housekeeping. And one last thing, I'm going to turn my video off as well so that we can focus more on the presentation ahead. So I'm just going to get off the screen now. Okay, so moving forward, we appreciate your time today, and we're going to move through to today's agenda. Quickly, we are going to discuss a broad overview of accessibility and what does NYU do to support accessibility. Then we'll move a little bit more into the micro aspect of what does the library do to support accessibility. And the big part of that is kind of supporting our web environment and kind of our resources online. So we're going to do a quick overview of web accessibility, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. And also a quick disclaimer before we begin the presentation, just to notify everybody in attendance that these materials are provided for informational purposes only and are not to be construed as legal advice. You should seek independent or house counsel to resolve the individualized legal issues that you are responsible for addressing. Further, any policy or procedure additions or revisions should be reviewed by your legal counsel prior to implementation. And I do mention that just because disability and accessibility do have kind of legal rights and implications. And so, again, this is just just for informational purposes, and you might have some specific questions that perhaps might come up, or you might need some more information on, but we just wanted to say, that there's more support if needed. And finally, just Iris and I want to let you know that neither one of us is actually fully trained. We don't have kind of disciplinary degrees in disability studies or accessibility services, but we are both kind of very, very strong advocates for this work in the libraries. And we've learned a lot over the last several years doing this work, and continue to learn both from each other, from the work that we're doing, and from those that the library serves and the greater NYU community serves. And just want to put it out there that we're learning too, and this work is ongoing and iterative. So one more time, thank you for joining us today and being interested in this. Okay. So we wanted to start with a baseline definition to develop a shared understanding of what accessibility means. So you'll see here on the screen that there is a definition provided by the US Department of Education, and it states that accessible means that individuals with disabilities are able to independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services within the same time frame as individuals without disabilities, and also with substantially equivalent ease of use, right? So we don't necessarily want to be making special accommodations for each and every person. We want to make our spaces and our services and our resources as accessible to everyone, for those with disabilities and without disabilities, so that there's a similar ease of access throughout. Also, a little bit more background, just wanting to provide some kind of data to back up kind of where we're being informed by this work and kind of supporting our work. And this is on the screen here is an infographic from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. And this data comes from about 2018, I believe, 2017, 2018 census data. And it states that 1 in 5 adults in the US has a disability, approximately 22%. And then 21.1% of adults, specifically in New York State, have some type of disability. And you'll see there's asterisks there that the asterisk will take you to some more information later once this presentation is shared to get some more nuanced information about those specific numbers. But the infographic on the screen is a bar chart from the Centers for Disease Control that shows the percentage of adults in the United States with functional disability types. So for example, individuals with mobility disabilities represent approximately 13.7% of the adult population. And then you'll see the next bar chart there, or the next bar on the chart is individuals with cognitive disabilities. Those are serious, that could include serious difficulty with concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. And that represents about 10.8%. And it goes on to provide an overview of those individuals who require independent living support, hearing, in individuals with hearing disabilities such as deafness or serious difficulty hearing, about 5.9%, vision such as blindness or serious difficulty seeing represent about 4.6% of adults, and then finally individuals that have difficulty dressing or bathing and providing self-care represent about 3.7% of the adults in the data collected. And I should also preface this with saying that, kind of the numbers aren't always perfect. And because, as you may be aware, there's oftentimes a lot of stigma around kind of self-disclosing that you have a disability. And so these numbers are probably a little underestimated. So just to go on a little bit further with some data, according to the CDC, again, 50 million people have reported having a disability in the US, and those are the individuals reporting, but as I was saying, not everybody reports, as well as most Americans at some point in their life will experience a disability. And, disabilities have a variety, a range of both physical, emotional, or cognitive disabilities, and disabilities can be visible at times, or they can be invisible as well. You may be able to tell that someone has a disability, but oftentimes you're not able to tell. So that's just, to provide a little bit of context of kind of the numbers. So it's also important to remember that in the context of the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, disability is a legal term rather than a medical one. So because it has a legal definition, the ADA's definition of disability is different from how a disability might be defined under some other laws, such as Social Security disability or related benefits. So the definition of an individual with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment, and this comes from the ADA. An individual has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. So the ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association. So yeah, like I said, just kind of laying out some foundational definitions and kind of legal jargon so that we all have a mutual understanding of kind of the work that is, the definitions that are leading this work. And so to provide some information about NYU specifically, at the moment, NYU doesn't kind of holistically gather data and report that data on students or staff or faculty or anybody of the community that do have a disability, but do know that the libraries work closely with other departments on campus, such as the Moses Center for Student Accessibility, the Office of Equal Opportunity, in order to kind of provide this service. And just to give you some of the numbers that the library has, as of spring 2019, which is a little more than a year ago, we have some spaces in the library that are set aside just for the use of students requiring the use of assistive technology, and we had close to 200 students registered for that, for access to that space. So just to give you an understanding of those numbers. Okay. I wanted to also just provide a quick presentation on the kind of legal implications of supporting individuals with disabilities. Not only is it the right thing to do, but we are legally required to do that. So there's several laws on the books, a few which are listed here. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act, both sections 504 and 508 apply to accommodations for Americans with disabilities, as well as then evolving to 1990. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and just as a note, this month is the 30th anniversary of the signing of that act. And then in 2008, the act was amended, and finally the ADA was reaffirmed in 2009. Some additional information about the ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. The ADA gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities similar to those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. It guarantees equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in public accommodations, employment, transportation, state and local government services, and telecommunications. So some of the things that are not listed on the screen that I just thought everybody should kind of be aware of are, in addition to the ADA celebrating our 30th anniversary this month, as I said, there's also Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's shortened to IDEA. And this act supports individuals in K-12 schools. So it's a law that makes available a free, appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities throughout the nation and ensures special education and related services to those children. And I mention this law because it doesn't necessarily, it's not used to enforce services in higher education, but students coming through K-12 and entering NYU may have certain expectations, rightfully so, to get the proper support they need. And so the libraries is doing its best to further kind of IDEA past the 12th grade. Other library-specific related laws on the books are the Copyright Act, the Chafee Amendment. It is Chapter 1, Title 17 of the United States Code, and it establishes a limitation on the exclusive rights in copyrighted works. And this amendment allows authorized entities to reproduce or distribute copies or phonorecords of previously published literary or musical works in accessible formats, exclusively for print-disabled persons. And the Chafee Amendment has been amended several times, and most recently in 2018 by the Marrakesh Treaty Implementation Act. Among other things, the 2018 amendment expanded the works covered by the Chafee Amendment from non-dramatic literary works to all literary and musical works, greatly expanding the rights and access to printed materials in alternative formats. And then finally, as mentioned, the Marrakesh Treaty facilitates access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. And this is facilitated by the World Intellectual Property Organization, so an international law as well. So, as you can see, there's quite a lot of precedent and kind of legal support for the work that the libraries does in making materials accessible in alternative formats, and kind of the mandate we have to provide services and spaces that are accessible. Okay. So moving away a little bit from more kind of technical laws and numbers and data, in these presentations, oftentimes Iris and I like to have a little bit of a discussion about inclusive language and some of the meaningful things that everybody can do in order to make their actions and patterns and behaviors a little bit more inclusive. So there is currently a movement afoot to use people first language as opposed to disability first language. However, I should say that this is not a universal preference. There's a lot of discussion about which identity kind of can be used first and is preferred. So it's an ongoing conversation. But in the libraries, we adopt people first language. So instead of saying the disabled or the handicapped, we use the language person with a disability. And very oftentimes we avoid using descriptive words like crazy or that's nuts or it's completely insane. We want to avoid using those words and in specific kind of reference to an individual who may have an emotional or behavioral disability, or say a person with mental health or psychiatric disability. It's very othering and not received well when we use certain words to kind of describe things. So there's a couple more examples up here on the screen, but we would use people first language again. Instead of saying the blind, we would say a person who is blind or visually impaired. So along the same lines of inclusive language and people first language, there's also, as I was kind of implying, ableist language and trying to avoid certain terms or phrases that we may just have as part of our common vernacular, such as it was a blind spot or so myopic, society is crippled by, falling on deaf ears, and that's crazy when. Any kind of those phrases, using those, definitely are kind of falling to the structure of an ableist structure. And so we want to not use physical condition of the eyes to describe ignorance or lack of awareness or understanding. We don't want to use a word that has historically described disabled people as broken if you're trying to talk about a way society is broken, right? You don't want to associate deafness with an unwillingness to understand, and not using mental illness as a metaphor for describing other things. And so there's, again, on the screen, some suggestions for kind of how to alter that language and kind of be more inclusive in our approach and kind of the language that we're using. Okay, and I have the word ableist up here, and I think it's worth also just maybe going into a definition of what ableism is and kind of tied into this idea of disability oppression, which we'll get to something we're going to talk about in a minute. But ableism as a definition is the all-encompassing system of discrimination and exclusion of people with disabilities. The system disables people on the individual, institutional, and cultural levels. Furthermore, ableism cuts across all of our other kind of interdisciplinary movements because ableism dictates how bodies should function against a mythical norm, an able-bodied standard of white supremacy, heterosexism, economic exploitation, and moral religious beliefs, age, and ability. And I should give credit that this kind of ableist language and inclusive language you see here on the screen are taken from some work that NYU's Center for Multicultural and Educational Programming group does, and they have these zone trainings, and one of their trainings is called the Disability Zone Training, where they go over an entire kind of social justice framework around ableism and confronting that. So I'm gonna move forward. a little bit more of an overview, and then we're going to get really into what's going on at NYU. Types of disabilities, there are visual impairments, cognitive impairments, specific learning disabilities such as dyscalculia or dyslexia. Autism spectrum disorder is considered a disability. Additionally, hearing impairments or deafness, mobility or dexterity issues. Again, this is just to illustrate that disabilities come in a variety of ways. Okay. And then this screen here, just to describe the two images. On the left, we have an individual in a wheelchair, and on the right, we have a set of stairs. And this info, these graphics are to kind of illustrate the two different kind of models of accessibility work, right? And so on the left, we have an individual or medical model that an individual in a wheelchair kind of is somebody to be fixed, or they have the problem, right? And that they require the accommodations of society, where on the right-hand side, the stairs, perhaps using stairs in a space is the problem, and we need to reconsider, a representation of the social model, but maybe stairs aren't the right tool to be using in a space, and kind of thinking through the way our facilities are built, and our, not just physical facilities, but our online spaces are built as well. And thinking through a social model takes an approach that allows for more of like kind of the socially created problem, and it's not an attribute of that ideal of that disabled individual. And the social model views disability as a complex collection of conditions, many of which are created by the social environment. So problem requires social action and is society's collective responsibility. And again, this graphic is up just because the library, NYU Libraries, does really strive to use the social model framework to kind of approach its accessibility services, right? We're not targeting specific individuals, we are trying to make overall our spaces and facilities and services better for everybody. I should also say, though, that there is, kind of a need sometimes as well for specific accommodations, right? So they can work in conjunction sometimes. Okay. Just one other thing before we go into a little bit more specifics is that the library also uses in this idea of the social model. We adopt a universal design model, as well as a universal design for learning, because a lot of the teaching we do in the libraries and work we do in the libraries it's an institution of learning. So universal design is a concept in which products and environments are designed to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And that's a quote from Ronald Mace, who is an architect who is the founder of this universal design movement, right? And so accessibility does make, with this universal design framework as an approach to kind of making spaces more accessible, we claim that accessibility makes services and spaces better for all, not just our individuals, our users with disabilities. And then just quickly, the universal design for learning is an extension of that kind of physical space model or framework, and goes to the way we approach teaching and engaging with kind of communicating information. So it's multiple means of representation, whether it's both physical and virtual, audio, as well as kind of just closed captioning is an example of universal design, where you provide it both via oral as well as kind of written on the screen, multiple means of expression and multiple means of engagement. So this is all just to say that the library is using these models to kind of inform the work that it's doing. Okay, and before I pass off to Iris, now a little bit more specifically at NYU, there is quite a big network of offices and support centers for the work that we're doing. So the libraries does work with the Provostial Working Group at NYU, which was convened about 5 years ago. It's the Disabilities Inclusion and Accessibility Working Group. And that group meets several times a semester to kind of discuss NYU accessibility at large, and also problem solve and support each other in building an accessibility program, a broader accessibility program at NYU. There is also the Center for Disability Studies, which was founded a couple of years ago as well, and they do tremendous work. They offer a minor for undergraduate students in disability studies, and they work closely with the Ability Project that is out of NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, which is a collaboration between Steinhardt, Tisch, and Tandon. The Ability Project encompasses research research, undergraduate and graduate courses, as well as community service learning initiatives to take on making a more accessible world. And then we also work with student groups like the Disability Student Union. So there is, as I was saying, a large network of support throughout the university. So with that being said, Iris is going to now take over and discuss a little bit more about services. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So I guess if we can have the next slide, that would be great. And so as Lauren was mentioning, there are lots of groups that are interested in supporting accessibility. And then there are some more formalized services, in particular at NYU. And these are services that the library works with in order to provide services for our students. So the Moses Center for Students with Accessibility, which Lauren mentioned, and also for employees, the Office of Equal Opportunity, or OEO, and then also NYU IT Digital Accessibility. So for students, the Moses Center for Students with Accessibility, it's a dedicated facility, and they coordinate the accommodations for students at NYU. This is a service that students have to register with, and that means that there is sort of a process in which they have to provide paperwork and various other support information, which indicates that they do in fact need accommodation. And that is something I just want to note, that can be, because not everybody is comfortable reporting, that can be something that can be a barrier for students accessing services. It can feel intimidating. And so the library is aware of that. And we do try to therefore design as much of our services to be universal, as Lauren was talking about, so that everyone can benefit and they don't necessarily have to specifically declare in order to receive a benefit, because we've designed our services to be universal, right? So just something to be aware of, that not everyone is comfortable talking about their disabilities or advocating, or may have the background or the financial resources to qualify to get that piece of paper to qualify for services. But the Moses Center is for students, and they do provide a lot of services to help students get accommodations. So they provide information for housing accommodations and service animals. And then in terms of academic accommodations, they help coordinate alternative material formats. So making textbooks into PDFs, and that's one of the ways that libraries might be involved. Testing accommodations, so if students need more time or they need to test in a different location, not in a classroom, they help coordinate note-taking if a student misses a class, and then also support some of the assistive technologies that's available through various labs across campus, and also supporting software that's widely available to our NYU community. And I just want to quickly mention that the two softwares that are available through for our entire NYU community. The read-write software is a set of software that helps make reading, writing, and comprehending text easier. So you may be able to save text as an MP3 or simplify web pages. It really has it's a bundle with lots of different sort of tools in it. And then also there's a document conversion software that is self-service, but it allows users to convert inaccessible documents. So something that may be like an image-only PDF or scanned images into a more accessible format. So this is some of the services that the Moses Center supports for NYU. And we work closely with them to coordinate the accommodations that the library would provide if there's particular needs there. So that number that Lauren was mentioning in the beginning, of like sort of what we know about who's registered for our assistive technology labs, we've worked with the Moses Center to coordinate that, so we have the right students getting the right resources. And then there's also the Office of Equal Opportunity. So this is staff support, which they focus on inclusive hiring practices, supporting mental, emotional, and physical disabilities. So for example, if an employee has carpal tunnel, they can request an ergonomic keyboard to help support a physical disability. There's also interactive process and cooperation of dialogue to determine individual accommodations. So they support reasonable accommodation. So you can work with them to coordinate, qualified readers or interpreters if you need that, or to use accrued paid leave or unpaid leave if you have an extended need for absence. And they work with employees to support that need. And then there's also the NYU Digital Accessibility. And this is mostly related to the work that I do is in my role as supporting digital accessibility. But this office from Central IT supports and oversees the university's effort to achieve digital accessibility. And I'll give a definition of that in a couple minutes. And the digital accessibility and also sort of the compliance element of that, because as Lauren mentioned earlier, there is often a legal element to providing accessibility. And they also support services which include how-to guides and accessibility feedback and assisting with reviewing content and running audits to make sure it's accessible. They do trainings, and then they also help us consult if we're going to be using vendor products to identify accessibility needs there. So next slide, please. Okay, so this, I want to just point out that on this slide there is an icon, and this particular icon, it's the accessibility icon. It's a person with arms and legs outstretched inside a circle. And this icon, the style of icon for accessibility is based in the social model of accessibility. So it recognizes the whole person and their needs rather than reducing them to just their disability. So like instead of representing accessibility as a whole with an icon that might be individual in a wheelchair, this is more thinking about the person first model versus the disability first model. So in terms of the services that the library is offering for accessibility, in order to support the strategic inclusion, diversity, belonging, and equity priorities of the libraries, there is a library accommodations standing committee. And this has representatives from different departments, and we're still growing. The departments are listed on this slide, but includes user experience, facilities, faculty librarians, our access delivery and resource sharing services, events, collections and content strategies. So that's the groups that help us purchase materials. And then of course, our IT department. And there are many more that are also participating in other ways. And then we work with these folks to identify opportunities and gaps in our accessibility services. And then we work with development to support our accessibility initiatives to make these solutions become real. So next slide, please. And so there are quite a lot of things that we have been up to as part of that group and the work that the departments are doing. So I just want to quickly highlight some of those things that have happened in the last couple of years. So there has been a lot of work that's happening at the department level to support the particular services that departments are offering to our faculty, staff, students, and general users. So groups that have been participating: campus media, our digital library technology services, digital scholarship services, development, facilities, our IT, the library's IT, NYU IT, NYU TV, and then reference services, special collections, lots of other groups. And we are always interested in talking to folks about how they might want to include accessibility in their department services. So we've offered programming both to our staff, but also sort of to our wider library community. We've had exhibits such as the Touch This Page, which was at Bobst and Dibner, and that was an interactive tactile exhibit talking about various technologies to help translate books into a tactile experience for users with visual impairments. And then of course, this particular presentation, the Getting to Know series, getting to reach a wider audience through that. We've been focusing on training and built this building culture of accessibility. We've been doing this for our internal colleagues as well. Zone trainings that Lauren mentioned. We are focusing on some of the technical elements of accessibility. So for digital accessibility, through training with our research guides, so training content creators to think about how to create digital content that's accessible. And then of course, coordinating some of those trainings with the Digital Accessibility Office and then the Moses Center as well, since they are experts in working with students. We have been supporting resource services through providing alternative formats of materials for students who are registered through the Moses Center. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about converting textbooks to PDF. If we have a book in the library that is a physical book, but that may not be accessible to someone, so we can scan that and have it be made digital so that it could be read by a screen reader, things like that our library staff help provide. We also have offered book paging for students that might have mobility issues that can't retrieve books from the shelves. And we also offer access to resources, digitized resources through our Hathi Trust. And this is a very large collection of digital resources that we may have a print version, but we may not have a digital version. And it is a way to provide digital access for students that may need it. We also have accessibility services on our website where we discuss, how users can request accessibility services and what we offer in terms of like how to navigate a building, where to get help, that kind of thing. We also recently have updated our adaptive technology labs and software. The labs are located right now. We have labs in both Dibner, which is in Brooklyn, and in Bobst on the Washington Square campus. And these particular labs enable us to have hardware and software that supports accessibility. So we have text-to-speech, screen magnification, and we've worked with the development team to identify donors and funding for this project. So we're really grateful for that. We received a $25,000 grant to improve the adaptive tech labs because technology does change and we needed to keep pace with that. So these are things that we are committed to keeping up to date as much as we can with the changing technology. And certainly there are, now that we are all remote and we are all doing so much more work digitally, there are advances that are happening that are digitally for accessibility that will probably be coming to our accessibility services, in the future. So we're kind of constant, it's a process, the adaptive technology is kind of constantly evolving. And so we are committed to keeping up with that. But some of the features that we have in the labs, we have the read-write software I mentioned, we have Mac computers, we have PCs, we have accessibility for the Google Suite, we have scanners, and these are really nice private spaces where students can use a combination of these adaptive technologies without having to fight for resources and things like that. So that was a really big win for us. And we have digital accessibility work that is going on. And this is something that the user experience department, along with other content creators in the library, are working to clear our, what we consider accessibility debt. And what we mean by that is the websites and the applications that we have and things like that, that may not have been initially designed with accessibility in mind. If they were designed 5-10 years ago, accessibility may not have been a priority. And so we're working to make these more accessible. And this is one of the priorities, certainly for our department, for our digital content and services. So our websites, our research guides, anything that really we're putting out to the public, and asking our students to use, students, faculty, staff to use for their success and their academic success. We are learning and implementing best practice as we move forward, as we do this debt clearing. We're implementing accessibility as part of our practice from the get-go now for anything new. And then we're embracing the universal design Lauren was talking about. We also are working with vendors to improve accessibility of the resources that we subscribe to and any of the vendor services that we might be thinking about purchasing. So really thinking about how we can get vendors to do the right thing and vendors to design so that we're not having to hack solutions or say like, well, this is the only library software that exists. So sorry, it's not accessible, but this is the only option. We really want to make sure that vendors are taking accessibility seriously. And right now, we know that most of our services are pretty BOPST and DIBNR-centric, but we really are working to try to align our services much more holistically across all of our sites. And then we also have, I want to mention the classroom services. Campus Media is part of the library. So this is a service that supports the technology that's in classrooms across all of NYU. And they've really worked hard to ensure that the technology that are in those classrooms are meeting the accessibility needs of faculty and students. So that's a really important win. So it's, you know, in the learning environments. And then there's been facilities improvements, the physical access to buildings, so including doors that have automatic openers, making sure that handles are more accessible, you know, working to improve the accessibility of our elevators and making sure that we have them, and then also improving the bathrooms so that we have more accessible bathrooms throughout our buildings. So next slide, please. And I know I've mentioned a couple times about digital accessibility, so I want to provide a definition there. So digital accessibility is the practice of ensuring that NYU websites, web applications, digital content can be used by our community who have a diverse range of hearing, movement, sight, or cognitive abilities. So again, this is thinking about that universal access, that everybody who is using our digital content should be able to experience it and engage with it successfully. And in the slides, once they're shared out, there's some additional information if you are interested in, there's a short video about what digital accessibility is. But I want to just talk a little bit about what makes something digitally accessible. How do we consider it digitally accessible? NYU and the libraries use a standard of accessibility, and it is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, often referred to as WCAG, and we use 2.0 level AA standards. And these standards were created by the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as 3WC. And these are standards that are applied across the United States, often globally. And these standards help us as designers and developers code our websites and our content, digital content, so it is compatible with the adaptive technologies and assistive technologies that users may be employing. And this is something that there are procedures that we have checklists that we can go through, and we can use the WCAG 2.0 standards, and we can check that against our sites and know that if you know, we have done all the things in that checklist, that these will meet accessibility standards. And this is something that we are currently working on, and you know, all of our new content, we are expecting that will meet those standards. That is part of the commitment that the libraries has made. So next slide, please. So additionally, NYU, to support this endeavor, because it is quite a big process, switching our, you know, our workflows, and also just bringing accessibility to mind when we think about digital, our digital content. NYU, the Digital Accessibility Office, has provided a bunch of resources, and these resources are publicly available to read in case you are interested later. But there's information about training and tools. So that might cover like how to make your Google document as accessible as possible. There's how-to guides. There's also information for procurement. So this may be, you know, again, if you are thinking about purchasing some software, and we certainly are doing this, if we're going to purchase new software, we want to make sure that it's accessible. And if it's not, we want to look for alternatives, or straight up tell the vendor that they should make it accessible, and then maybe we will consider purchasing it. And then they've also provided a sort of top 10 digital accessibility checklist. And this is something that applies, you can apply to most web content, that if you're focusing on these things, which include having page titles and descriptions, thinking about your layout, are you using headings? So that would be like an H1 or an H2 in your HTML code. Are you using headings to appropriately, and are they separating your content into segments? Have you thought about the color contrast, the visibility of your site? How readable is your site? Is the content concise? Are you indicating what language your site is in? Are you using links that are descriptive? And this is something that, as a takeaway for anyone who's here, this is a really, it's a relatively easy, but it's an important practice that you can implement. If you are including a link to any web page, avoid the click here concept. If you label a link click here, that doesn't tell you where a user may be going when they click. So describing the destination of a link is really important, and we call that contextual link. So if the link is just floating out in space without any of the words around it, will a person still know where that link is going to take them? It also focuses on image descriptions, having alt text, which is describing what is in an image, and this alt text will coordinate with the screen reader, so that a user who may have a visual impairment will also get the information out of that image as well. Providing media captions, and also making sure that we're coding so that all parts of a website or an app will be accessible in case a user can't use a mouse. So they can use their keyboard instead, and everything is still accessible. So next slide, please. So in terms of what we're doing in the libraries, we are using those resources, and then we're building out our own services and our own adjustment of our services to make sure that the library-specific digital content is accessible as possible. So we're really focusing on the accessibility part of the IDBE strategic priorities for the digital element. We are training as many people as we can. We're raising awareness about digital accessibility and providing learning opportunities for that. And then we're really focusing on the remediation element as well. And the remediation element is going back and looking at our code and looking at our content and making those changes against that, like those WCAG standards. And so remediation is really time-intensive work. And in order to better support ourselves and our users moving forward, we're incorporating accessibility into workflows and best practices for departments and for projects. And so what we want to do with that is make sure that we are thinking about accessibility from the get-go, that it is part of all projects, that we are asking ourselves, like, how are we including accessibility? What are the considerations here? We are encouraging folks to make documents accessible from the beginning, because it's much easier to make something accessible to start with than fixing it later. And then considering establishing best practice and training for each department, for their own materials and the way that they provide services. And then really, again, working with vendors to ask them the questions about accessibility, like how are they dealing with it? And sometimes vendors are not. So getting them to starting that conversation with them is important, because many universities are prioritizing this. And if all the vendor clients are prioritizing it, they should also prioritize it. And then also working on communications in general, thinking about, like, are we communicating as accessibly as possible? And then we also offer opportunities for users to report if they're encountering accessibility issues as well. Next slide, please. So the things that we're focusing on next, talked a little bit about what we have done, and our next things that we're concentrating on are thinking about how we're going to make our digital collections and our special collections accessible and supporting that work. Special collections and digital collections include images, audio, and video materials, which really require specialized support of time and money to make them accessible. This includes video captioning, audio and video transcripts, and image descriptions, and that is quite labor intensive and often cannot fully be automated as a process. So we're also looking at continuing the facilities improvements in the buildings across the entire library system. So thinking about our bathrooms, thinking about our furniture, and how we're laying out our spaces, how are we structuring our service points to be accessible, and again, continuing with the adaptive technology labs, keeping those up to date, and then identifying opportunities for sensory friendly spaces where we can reduce the noise level or the foot traffic distraction that might be related to those rooms. And then again, we're continuing to work with the vendors and really pushing them on the accessibility, that this is a priority for us. And we do have an advantage that NYU is a really big organization. So we do have some pull, which is really nice. And, we want to keep harnessing that and asking them questions. And then we really are thinking about how to build a community conversation around accessibility, and including our students, our faculty, our staff, alumni, and our researchers about their experiences with accessibility and what they may need to ensure that our resources are accessible, and really opening up that channel of discussion. So, in true UX experience, we want to know what their experience is so we can improve it. So I'm going to now open it up for, Lauren, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if you have questions or observations, experiences, concerns about accessibility and library accessibility or accommodations, Lauren and I are happy to answer those. And yeah, thank you everyone so much for being here today. This is really great and really helps us build this culture of accessibility. The more that we are talking about it and just raising awareness, it's been really helpful.
Just a reminder that you can ask questions two ways, either by entering them in the chat or by using the raise hand feature in the participants tab. Okay. Oh, we have a question in the chat. Okay. Have you had any success in integrating thinking about accessibility during creation and implementation of library policies? So, yeah, I think that's something that we are, so yes, I think we have had that in the fact that we have the IDBE committee, which is working on policies and setting that, and the fact that these policies are coming from the, they're coming from the top down, and that awareness of accessibility is happening at like the highest levels of the library. So that really helps push the accessibility policy. Lauren and I are very fortunate in that we have a really receptive community here, and libraries are a really wonderful place to be talking about accessibility, because ultimately everyone's really about providing services to our users. So it hasn't been as much of an uphill battle as I know sort of other institutions may have with accessibility, and we're very fortunate because we're being supported both from like the services end and also like the IT end, knowing that this is a priority for everybody. So we're not having to do as much fighting on that. And certainly I can speak a little bit to like the web policy. Like that is something that we were able to say that, if there's new content on the web, it needs to be accessible from the start. And like, if not, it doesn't get published. And I think that's something that is, it may seem harsh, but like, not providing accessible content to people is also harsh. So we've been lucky there.
Yeah, I just want to add to, in our COVID reopening plans, you know, there's been a lot of discussion. We've been invited to provide support and feedback on that. So even in like everything that we're doing going forward, you know, it's really been wonderful that we're invited to the table to have these conversations, and accessibility has been embraced as a priority and made important to be discussed at every aspect.
Yeah, I just like to kind of second that, you know, with the idea that we're all remote and the return to building, accessibility, some of the challenges that so our accessibility group has been working on, like some of these challenges that users may be facing that you know, need accommodations are kind of more apparent to all users now that we're working remotely. So it's building some empathy around some of these issues with digital, at least for digital accessibility.
Thank you. We have a question, a raised hand question from Eric. Eric, I'm going to unmute you. There we go. You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about, let's say, alt text and putting database accessibility. Should it be handled on the web or in the collection? For instance, if I want to say put a digital collection of images online and it's 1,000 images, do you find it to be a best practice that I should be looking for collection management software that facilitates alt text, or should I be just getting that information online and then dealing with it in terms of web development?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think in having gone through the experience, like we've done sort of multiple rounds of remediation of content. If you can include, like if you're creating databases of, you know, or if you're doing digital asset management and you have a system where you've got a DAM that is enables you to attach that alt text information from the get-go. So like the person that's looking at the image right away and they're captioning or describing that image, if you can do the alt text at the same time, it's going to be a lot easier. Going back and fixing things is always more time consuming, both like financially, you know, and work hour kind of time consuming. So I guess some of that would depend on, like, if you have a system that lets you include alt text, that's excellent. If you're sort of doing something that's homegrown, you would have to do it maybe more kind of from the back end through the code. But either way, you'd want to, from like an NYU standpoint, you'd want to make sure that whatever goes up has alt text from the get-go, from a user perspective. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that, like off this particular presentation. If you have questions, you can email us, and Lauren, Nicole has the contact info for us for that. So happy to talk to you more about that. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Christina. Christina asks, copyright clearance for alternative formats. This is through the Moses Center, question mark?
Sure, I can take that question. So the Moses Center does handle student requests for alternative formats. And so if a student needs an alternative format, they are supposed to be contacting the Moses Center to get that material, procure that material. So if it is a textbook, Moses Center has relationships to kind of get accessible alternatives to those textbooks, let's say. They also are able to convert print to Braille and other formats as well. However, I want to say that the library has been working ever more closely with the Moses Center, and there is a longstanding partnership to kind of to procure these materials. And so the library is also kind of a participant in making these materials accessible and kind of ensuring that copyright is cleared. But just back to an early part of the presentation, just with the Marrakesh Treaty and with the Chafee Amendment, there is you know, there's legal precedent that making alternative formats for individuals with disabilities is within legal bounds. So so that copyright clearance for individuals with disabilities isn't, you know, you don't have to make as many requests. So hopefully that answers the question. But there is a relationship that students should be going to the Moses Center to kind of let them know that this is the materials they need. The Moses Center does everything they can to procure those materials, and then they also work with the library again to get those materials. And so that relationship is longstanding and evolving, but Moses handles most of the procurement. Oh, sorry, and one more thing, should say, as part of what the library is trying to do, right, is to ensure that the materials that we license, thus have the copyright permission for, whether it's via our databases or our ebook vendors or the kind of copies we make, because sometimes we will scan materials and we make them, you know, we scan them through OCR. You know, the library is also working to ensure that the products that we provide access to, as well as kind of the services we offer, are incorporating that copyright permission.
Great, thank you. I just popped Iris and Lauren's emails in the chat if you have additional questions. We are right at 1 o'clock right now, so if anyone else has any questions, now's your chance to either pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Christina asked a sort of additional follow-up beyond the requests through the Moses Center.
I guess, yeah, I wonder if we could clarify a little bit more, like if you're a faculty member or.
Yeah, and Christina, we're also happy to take it to email, and we can answer any questions you have about that copyright and try to figure out what, you know, if there's specific stuff that you're being asked to provide. And that's true of, you know, anybody who has questions about that.
Okay, great. Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you everybody so much for coming. Iris and Lauren, thank you for everything today. And we hope to see you at other events. Stay tuned to the NYU Libraries Eventbrite page, and we have other events coming up. And again, if you have questions for us, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you everybody, and enjoy your afternoons.
Thank you.
Thank you.